Hey guys, what's up? What's up? How are you? I hope you're doing well. I hope you guys are doing well. Hold on just 1 second for me. All right. So listen, I'm coming through with another. Uh, it's another one, as DJ Khaled would say, right? Another one. And basically, this is going to be a pretty interesting one. Shout out to those of you on excuse me. Shout out to those of you that are on YouTube, who are on Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, Bigo. I mean, I literally stream everywhere at this point. So shout out to those of you on Bigo. I'm still just kind of getting familiar with it. So I hope you all enjoy this. And please share the video. What you are going to watch here momentarily is titled "Walking with the Tall Whites." This was a book called Millennial Hospitality that was made into a documentary. Okay. Now, here's the thing, there's a man named Charles Hall and he'll explain who he is, but I'm just going to kind of play it and let it go, and you will come to whatever conclusion you come to. But he is absolutely believable. I believe him 1000%. And with all the research that I've done in my life of 44 years, I believe he's telling the absolute truth. Needless to say, there are aliens known as the tall whites that are currently living and operating out of Nellis Air Force Base. Again, the book is called Millennial Hospitality by Charles Hall. And the documentary that you're about to watch is called Walking with the Tall Whites. Enjoy. And if you don't mind, give me a thumbs up if you don't mind. And if you have a few, beans or diamonds or whatever it is that I'm supposed to be getting on Bigo, because I have no clue how to operate it, feel free to throw some of those my way if you enjoy the content. Here we go. Versions, and you kind of have to test these tall whites. The tall whites at Nellis Air Force Base. This is a species of alien. This man here, Charles Hall, has a few books called Millennial Hospitality, a series that he actually put together. He's released over the years. He is a nuclear physicist, a He was back in 67, 68, and 69. He was a weather specialist. You know how on many military bases across the world, you'll have people there that are designated weather specialists. They report in things, and they're very crucial to reporting of meteorological events, that sort of a thing. But Charles Hall actually had top secret orders. He had top secret orders. He knew each day that he was dealing with something that was not human. The way he describes these beings, they grow 8-9 feet tall. They actually continue growing through their lifetime, and it actually will kill them eventually. To the transparent hair. The hair is so white, it's transparent. That they have family units. In other words, mothers, fathers, children. Okay. Charles Hall, I don't know what, he's been around here many years. You don't really typically see him, though, doing the whole UFO circuit thing. But you guys, check this out and just, sit back, let your mind wander here. It's okay to do that from time to time.
They got too close so that I felt uncomfortable, as in the case of the tall white lady at the theodolite stand. I would back away and they would stay where they were until I had backed away to where I felt comfortable. So that before we began talking, we would first come to a distance where we both felt comfortable. You see, I've always felt that was, and then if I got too uncomfortable, if I felt like going away, they wouldn't pursue. And I felt that was very important in being able to deal with the tall whites, because it allowed both me and the tall white individual, whichever one I was dealing with, to come to a common distance where we were willing to talk to each other. For some, like the teacher or Range 4 Harry, that might be as little as 10 feet. For others, like that tall white general, well, I didn't want him closer than a quarter mile, Yeah.
My bad. I didn't even acknowledge the chat. My bad, y'all. What's up, everybody? Talk to me with Brian. What's up with it, baby? Texas Trill all day. Hey, Third Eye. Yes, I did. Gloria, hello. Heaven Sent, hello. Hey, Levine.
Scoutcraft using material. Their scoutcraft and their deep spacecraft had a double hull construction. And for example, in the case of the scoutcraft, in between those two hulls, they had what appeared to be 1,000 miles of fiber optic windings. They built the scoutcraft using materials supplied them by the U.S. Air Force. The scoutcraft were clearly built here on this Earth. When you went on board, many of the parts, like the seats, still had the mold markings of American manufacturers like Lockheed, Boeing, the overhead compartments by Airstream, and so on. And so therefore, it had to be perfectly possible to build a scoutcraft with its anti-gravity drive using ordinary American parts. The scoutcraft had the fiber optics windings came in several sets, and the way it worked is it worked in a manner philosophically the same as an electromagnet. It's just that they did not. In an electromagnet, you use electrons on copper going down copper wires and coils. Instead, instead of electrons, they used some other subatomic particle. I'm not sure which one. It's my understanding that there are 3 different ones, or maybe 5 different ones, perhaps mesons or bosons or those subatomic particles, and then that put out anti-gravity. The particle generators looked like batteries, where there was one that would create the particles and accelerate them into the fiber optics, and then the fiber optics amplified the anti-gravity field the same way that an electromagnet amplifies the electric field or the magnetic field.
Now, I think it's important to note this. fiber optic cabling, okay, is a really big, huge step up from Cat5 cabling, which is what you may typically be used to for your cable, modem, internet connections, even your DSL connections. But fiber optic cable, the thing about it, inside of it, I don't know if any of you have ever put together like a Cat5 cable before. There's a color scheme that you have to get just right for those data bits to be able to run through the wiring, okay? But fiber optics cable is made of glass on the inside. To have had 1,000 miles of fiber optic cabling in a craft in 1969, fiber optic cabling didn't even exist in the public until like about a decade or so ago. And even then, I mean, the fastest connections we used to get to data centers was like OC3. That was before fiber optics came around. So again, it's made out of pure glass. It basically allows that connection to go faster than the speed of light. So so what he's basically saying is they're running an atomic particle through this fiber optic cabling, not data bits that you would use to process a computer, but actual atomic particles which decay. Once they decay, they become radioactive. And that apparently was a concern that they had, but you're going to hear him discuss how they protected themselves from it. But in order to have this craft do these amazing things to create this gravitational field around it, and remember how Bob Lazar explained it, you could literally lift the craft up in the air, walk under it, look up, and you wouldn't even see it. It actually can generate a cloak of invisibility. And you may recall Bob Lazar talking about sport mode, normal mode and sport mode. Normal mode, and he's going to describe it here a little bit, but there's two modes. One, just imagine, you're driving in the city. The second one is your more long-term drive. You're going to go out to the country, visit your folks, that sort of a thing. So just wanted to explain that piece.
And then there was another one that picked up the particles. Of course, they had to be refueled after, they had to be recharged just the way a battery has to be recharged. The same technology was used on their suits, the ones that allowed them to levitate. And if they were running the suit at full power and they came out from their rest area at 11:30 at night, then by 5:30 in the morning, the suit was almost out of power. So that the batteries they had in their suits would only last 6 hours or so. The batteries on the deep spacecraft obviously also had a limit to how long, had to be recharged periodically. Although I'm not sure how long that limit was, but it perhaps depended on the craft. The deep spacecraft would arrive and leave on schedule, and the shortest schedule was 2.5 months. The longest schedule that I saw was 5 years. So they had to be able to carry fuel to recharge the batteries for that long, or their technology had to allow the batteries to be recharged for that long. But they did have to be recharged. You did have to periodically stop and put in a new power source. The outer set of coils served to streamline the craft for travel within space itself. And when the outer set of coils were powered up, it also protected them from the forces of acceleration and deceleration. As I described in book 2, it was common to see the scout craft, if it were sitting out in the desert some distance, and perhaps say 3 miles, when it was sitting there unpowered, it would just look like a white ellipsoid with windows and the way you'd expect. When they powered up the outer set of coils, it would take on a fuzzy appearance. The outer field obviously protected them from radiation in space as well. Then when they lifted up off the desert, if they had the outer coils energized, they were capable of tremendous performance. It was common to see the scout craft accelerate from 0 to 8,000 miles an hour, travel just a short distance, like 7 miles or 10 miles, stop and sit down again, and then turn off the coils. The people on board didn't belt themselves in. They just sat in chairs the way we do, because they didn't feel the force of acceleration. If they did not have the coils.
That is nuts. That's freaking nuts. The fact that they can actually get in the craft and just sit down in a chair without a seatbelt and zip, from 0 to 8,000 miles per hour in a split of a second. But if you really think about it, if you're creating your own gravitational bubble around you and you're in the very center of that bubble, you wouldn't feel the acceleration. You wouldn't feel anything. It's probably the smoothest ride in the air that many have experienced. I think another interesting thing too that he mentions is how the shortest trip, he would literally see the same people, the same tall white aliens, every so often. Plus he would even see new tall white aliens that had never even seen human beings before. Apparently, these tall whites were mesmerized by how human beings have the ability to multitask. Apparently, one of the character traits of these tall whites is they concentrate on one thing at a time, literally. They're eating, they're going to concentrate on eating. They're not going to be listening to music and looking at their phone and eating at the same time. They're just going to be eating. They're just going to be concentrating on that one task. It's very interesting.
Powered up, however, if they were bringing the scout craft in real close, like if they were going to park it beside the Range 3 lounge, they would turn off the outer set of coils while they were still some distance away, because the field coming off that outer set of coils extended a great distance from the craft. Of course, before they turned off the coils, they would first slow to maybe 3 or 5 miles an hour. And then once they turned off the coils, then they drove it like a baby buggy. Okay. Then they just came in real slow and landed like at 2 or 3 miles an hour. And when they took off, if they hadn't charged up the coils, then they would be traveling just 2 or 3 miles an hour. They'd be traveling like a baby buggy, and they wouldn't. But it wasn't until they'd powered up that other set of coils that they would start doing high-speed performance. Powering up the coils took a little while, just like turning on an electromagnet. It was common for it to take as long as 10 seconds for the coils to power up. Because the particles that are running through the fiber optics are subatomic particles that do decay, the coils would heat up if you ran at full power for too long. And the tall whites were always very conscious of the temperature of the coils. And therefore, it was very common to see them when they sat down on the desert, on occasion, especially on hot days, to get out and open up the panels on the outside of the deep space, on the outside of the scout craft, obviously just letting the coils cool off. It doesn't mean the coils were necessarily too hot, but they liked the coils running cold, and they're always very conscious of the coil temperature. On that day, that scout craft suffered a meltdown of the fiber optics. Now that, as I remember, was a Wednesday, and they worked on that craft from...
Y'all, fiber optics in 1969, I just am still quite amazed by that. Internet didn't even exist in 1969. We were still on telephone. If you lived in small towns, you could literally dial somebody's number by just dialing 4 digits. Only as people expanded and more homes needed phone numbers did you have to extend out to 7 digits, then 10 digits. And it's just going to get bigger and bigger the more area code you need, right? When I was younger here in Dallas, even in my early 20s, 214 was our main area code. Now we got 469, 940, 214. Like I could go on and on and on. It's that many people, that many phone numbers that have been recycled. But 1969. So if you ever wonder to yourself about the explosion of technology, really since Roswell, the explosion of the internet, the way that speed has become so much faster. And I think about that because my first machine was a freaking Packard Bell, okay? My first computer. I had a 14.4 baud modem. You were doing good to get 28. And then 56K modems came out, okay? And many of us went and replaced our old 14.4 baud modems for the 56K. And that was pretty much the traditional standard. I mean, you couldn't even put a lot of images on a web page because it would take forever and a day to load, because that was the speed. Y'all remember the dear AOL? It was dial up. But for fiber optics to have actually even existed already, that's nuts. That's nuts.
Wednesday, 24 hours a day till the following Monday morning, just getting enough coils repaired so that they could lift off and take it back to the base. And in order to take it back to the base, they had to bring out 2 extra scout craft. In the meantime, they brought out several others with mechanics and stuff. And they had to nurse it back to base by running 2 extra scout craft on each side, just to get it back to base where they could fiddle with the coils. Recovering from a coil meltdown was obviously a big problem for them.
All right, guys, listen, it's ad time. It's ad time. Give me just a moment. If you don't mind, I would like to premiere my little quick Bigo ad that I created in, like, I don't know, 10 seconds or some shit like that. It didn't take me long. But give me just a moment, because I'm really trying to grow my Bigo. And man, I'm been pleasantly surprised at times. I'll be on Bigo, and I'll end the live, and there's like 1,000 people that watched, and I'm just like, what's going on here? What in the world is going on here? And every single time, usually it's at least 400 or 500 every single time. And so anyway, I won't give out my formula or anything like that, but yeah, it's been really, really cool. And so I'm really working hard, you know to get my Bigo thing going on. So anyway, let me do that really quickly. All right. I mean, it's obviously very short, okay? I put just a little bit of effort into it, but enough. But I will make a much better ad. But please follow me on Bigo. I've got the ad in the description. I also put the link, or the link in the description. I also put the link in the live chat. So listen, let's play the rest of this. Let's finish watching this amazing documentary. And yeah, we'll go from there. And shout out to those of you on all platforms, including Bigo, baby, my new love.
3 miles an hour, they'd be traveling like a baby buggy. And they wouldn't, but it wasn't until they'd powered up that other set of coils that they would start doing high-speed performance. Powering up the coils took a little while, just like turning on an electromagnet. It was common for it to take as long as 10 seconds for the coils to power up. Because the particles that are running through the fiber optics are subatomic particles that do decay, the coils would heat up if you ran at full power for too long. And the tall whites were always very conscious of the temperature of the coils. And therefore, it was very common to see them when they sat down on the desert on occasion, especially on hot days, to get out and open up the panels on the outside of the deep space, on the outside of the scout craft, obviously just letting the coils cool off. It doesn't mean the coils were necessarily too hot, but they liked the coils running cold, and they're always very conscious of the coil temperature. On that day, that scout craft suffered a meltdown of the fiber optics. Now that, as I remember, was a Wednesday, and they worked on that craft from Wednesday, 24 hours a day, till the following Monday morning, just getting enough coils repaired so that they could lift off and take it back to the base. And in order to take it back to the base, they had to bring out 2 extra scout craft. In the meantime, they brought out several others with mechanics and stuff. And they had to nurse it back to base by running 2 extra scout craft on each side, just to get it back to base where they could fiddle with the coils. Recovering from a coil meltdown was obviously a big problem for them. That I never saw any humans working on the coils. The tall whites were I never saw any Air Force personnel or anybody out there with them. The tall whites always reserved the option, or anything to do with the coils, they always wanted only tall whites on there. As far as I know, I'm the only human that got anywhere close to the coils. I got to within a few hundred feet before their guard blocked my way and made it clear that he didn't want me to go any closer. It might have been because, since they're running subatomic particles, maybe he was just concerned about the radioactive fields coming off it. But he didn't want me up there touching them or anything. I've been on board the Scout craft, but not on board the deep spacecraft. The deep spacecraft, which are the same design and the same technology but much larger, are titanium black, right? The one that came in damaged with meteor damage. That is I got closer to that one than any of the other deep spacecraft. That one I got within a few hundred feet of as it came by me in the snowstorm. And so I did see a great deal about the deep spacecraft, but the only creatures I ever saw in the deep spacecraft were the tall whites themselves. On the Scout craft, however, it was common to see American U.S. Air Force generals on the Scout craft along with their tall white counterparts. That was very common, and I myself was on the Scout craft. However, they never came to just take me for a joyride. They never came to say, "Oh, let me show you the sun and the moon and the stars." I don't know, maybe they would have if I'd asked them, but they knew that we had rank and that I was an enlisted man, the lowest of the low. If there's a latrine to be cleaned, I'll be the one doing the work. And they were well aware that generals who show up with 4 stars were given the orders, and I was pretty much taking them. So it's not like they, it's not like they ever came purely to entertain me with their scout craft. On that occasion, when I was on board their scout craft, remember, they had several new arrivals who were part of the technology transfer, and their motivation for taking me on board the scout craft on that particular day appeared to be that the new arrivals, who were afraid of me, had to practice coming up to Charlie and saying, "Hello, Charlie," and then and then once having gotten to within 10 feet of the gorilla, then they would back away and stay out there like 20 feet. They'd so bravely faced me down in the sagebrush, I guess. But I guess what they were thinking of, I believe what they were thinking of on that day, is that they were going to suggest to the American generals additional technology exchange projects. And I think they were using me as the test guinea pig to take me on board the scout craft and show me their living quarter, show me what was on board the scout craft. And then they could test my reaction to what I thought was good and what I thought was, what I was impressed with and what I wasn't with. And then I think they were saying, therefore, then when they went and talked to the American generals, they could say, "We'll make this better for you and that not so good for you." Or, "We'll make this better for you. We can help you here." The scout craft was made completely out of American parts and looked like an RV trailer. When you went on board, it was ellipsoidal, and the scout craft was white with windows on both sides. More windows. The door, when you looked at the front when you were standing looking at the front of the scout craft, the door was on that craft was on the right. Since they were all made here, there was a number of different variations in the design. and the windows on that side extended further back than on the left side. There were no windows on the back, none on the top, none on the bottom, and only one door, the one on the right, which opened from the top. And much like a Learjet, or I've some Learjets, when you went on board, there was a bulkhead about a third of the way back. In front of the bulkhead on all the scout craft, the design was the same. There were 5 seats without seat belts that you just sat in. The tall whites are not built strong like we are, and so the idea of belting themselves in would damage their bodies. There was 2 seats for the pilot and the co-pilot, and then 3 other seats in the front. And they weren't very interested in showing me the cockpit area. They said there wasn't much about it that I would understand anyway. On the bulkhead, there was a set of panels. Nowadays, we consider it old hat, switches that don't move like you have on microwave ovens. But in the 60s, that was considered pretty avant-garde, even though I realized that the first motionless switch was actually copyrighted in more or less about 1929, but they weren't in common use. On each switch, there were a set of icons. Now we consider that old hat too, because you buy your car and there's icons. But in the 60s, that was considered pretty avant-garde. The icons were pretty ordinary. One controlled the outside lights, and it looked like the sun. One controlled the inside lights. And so in terms of the icons, there wasn't, or the hieroglyphs on the switches, they weren't very different than, say, hieroglyphs on the Egyptian pyramids or the icons that you see on a modern day automobile. Behind the bulkhead, there were at least 3 or 4 different designs depending on which model of the scout craft you were looking at. In the RV model, the one that on that day that I was on, what was behind the bulkhead was an ordinary RV. When you went in there and you were looking towards the back, on the right there was a microwave oven, only where the aliens had taken off the mechanical door and put on a different cover with coils around it. And then when they turned on the oven, they first turned on the coils, and the coils put out the standard field and prevented the microwaves from going through that field into the room beyond. So it looked like a little cave where you'd turn it on and then turn it off, and you didn't have to fiddle with the door, you see. In the back was the latrine, just like in an RV. On the left, they had the seats where you would eat, but also they had hammocks where the children would sleep. And then they had the overhead compartments and a few storage things in the back, although not a great many of them. And then on the bulkhead in the front, they had a mirror and a makeup table where the teacher would put on her stuff. And it was all pretty ordinary. That was the RV model. My website is millennialhospitality.net, where I have additional information relating to my books and the Millennial Hospitality series. The number of tall white aliens at the base varied somewhat depending on how many deep spacecraft were in port. However, as I describe in Book 3 in the chapter entitled The End of Innocence, on one night I saw between 200 and 300 different tall white individuals. There were so many I couldn't count them. Lined up along the mountains to the east up along where the ammunition bunker was. On the night that the tall white lady known as Pamela was supposed to finish her final exam to be head of the technology transfer team to go into Livermore. On that night, as I described in my book, she panicked and failed. But in amongst those 200 or 300 tall whites, and that's just an estimate because I couldn't. It was a crowd of people and I couldn't count them all. There were also American Air Force personnel, nobody below the rank of colonel. There was like a 4-star general, a 3-star general. There were several of them. There were also several American government people in civilian clothing over there. The tall white individuals that they were talking to appeared to come from all walks of life. Some of the tall whites were clearly the tall white equivalent of generals. Others were clearly the equivalent of tall white civilian government people. But there were an awful lot of tall whites who weren't obviously part of the military, but were just women and children. At one point, for example, the tall white lady whose CIA name was the teacher was standing out in front of the line with a group of children around her and was pointing out the position of the balloon that I had released and where it was in the sky for them to all watch the balloon floating. And the tall whites had a social structure, a division of labor, very similar to our own. And so some were military people, some were medical people, and they had personalities accordingly. On that night, I counted between 35 and 50, perhaps as many as 75 scout craft that had parked in the part of the desert that I had dubbed the parking area. There were so many, I lost count of the number of, I couldn't count them all. But I estimated that somewhere between 35 and 50 was a reasonable count, but there may have been 75. So the number of tall white individuals and scout craft, was at least that large. I have no idea if that was everybody on the base that had come down or if that what percentage that was, but the number of people that you could see, the number of individuals that you could come across was at least in that numeric range. The number, when they came around to where I was, they came around, the kinds of individuals that came around were from all walks of life. And the tall white doctor came around and the tall whites he brought with him appeared to be medical students. They had no interest in the mechanical aspects of what I was doing, although the doctor, like a human doctor, he cared only about the humanistic aspects. On the other hand, on a different night, one of the tall white guards brought around three young adult tall white men who were clearly electrical engineers. One of the tall white individuals that I was reasonably good friends with called himself co-pilot, but he was very proud of his ability to repair the scout craft, and he wanted to have been called the mechanic, but I guess the name was taken, and so he had to pick a different name, And another one was called the captain. He didn't appear to understand humans very well, and he didn't appear to want to. He appeared to just want to come and do whatever he had to do, and then if whatever you were for humans, well, that was you, and go on about his business. Whereas the doctor, described in The Wayward Wind, he wanted to come and really understand humans. What are they like, you see? Others, like the tall white general that I previously referred to, the idea of him understanding anybody, that he didn't care to understand anybody. He came to give the orders, and you were there to take them, And if you liked him, fine. If you didn't like him, fine. But he was the general. They were all like that. The teacher was there and with the guards, and the children were playing on the steps of the control tower. And I walked over close to her, 10 feet or so, and and on that night she was willing to answer a few questions. And I asked what she thought of humans and the planet Earth. I asked her how it compared with other inhabited planets that they had seen. And she said that they considered the Earth to be a cold, desolate wilderness. On the other hand, she said the thing that they found unique about humans is our willingness to do things with animals. Her example was that I grew up on a farm in Wisconsin. I feel very comfortable milking cows, riding horses, making pets with dogs. Yet each of those animals could kill me if they wanted to. I don't think of it that way because instead, like all humans, I first try to decide how the animal is thinking, and then I approach the animal accordingly. So I calm down the horse by speaking to it nicely and approaching it from the front. I put the cow in a stanchion and calm it down and begin milking. I make friends with the dog by feeding it and patting it on its head. She said that they considered that to be very unusual. She said that on most inhabited planets, once a group of intelligent people evolved, they had no interest in dealing with the less intelligent animals and usually just killed them all off. You know, they had no intent. That she pointed out that I felt comfortable with pets of cows, pets making pets of dogs, making pets of, she referred to the time a few days earlier that I'd been down playing with some of the dogs that really weren't my dogs, but from people that lived in the housing area, feeding them and teaching them to roll over and sit up. She said usually the intelligent people just, don't care what the dog thinks, just shoots them, and they found humans to be very unusual in that regard. And the way she described it is because we were willing, even though we were intelligent, we were willing to try to think like less intelligent animals. Okay. They always came armed. Now the children weren't armed, and the adults that were very old typically weren't armed. But the young adults and the adults that weren't too fragile, they always came armed. Their weapons, their weapons typically appeared to be look like white pencils with a certain squarish cross section. The young adults typically carried weapons that were perhaps 6 inches long. The older adults typically carried weapons that were longer, presumably with greater power. The weapon worked like a microwave laser. Um, the weapon could be adjusted for frequencies appropriate for different elements. If they adjusted it for the frequency of sodium, for example, in the human nerves there are sodium atoms and calcium atoms. And if they adjusted it for sodium and fired it at you, it would make it seem like you were getting an electric shock. Like, depending on the power of the weapon, it'd feel like you just touched a high voltage wire of 100,000 volts and was extremely painful. If they set it high enough, they could kill you by just going zappo and you'd be electrocuted. If they had it set low, then it would just give a tingling affair and they never actually used the sodium setting on me, but I did meet, for example, a CIA guard who said that one day he had been walking with the teacher coming down the steps of the Capitol building. And because their bone structure is slightly different than ours, he wasn't familiar with the way they look when they're walking down steps. And he said they were partway down, and it looked to him like the teacher was going to fall. And so without thinking, he reached out and grabbed her by the elbow to steady her. And he said she almost killed him. She jerked the weapon, set it to the sodium setting, and had him down on his knees saying, "You think we're fools? You think we're idiots? You think I'd come here if I couldn't take care of myself?" And she said, it was all he could do to breathe when she used that weapon on him. And he was absolutely terrified of her. She put him through 5 or 10 minutes of, who's giving the orders and who's taking them, and it was nothing but yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And, and they never did that to me. Although in addition to the guard, I met a number of guys they had done that to. If they moved it to the calcium setting, then it was like putting you to sleep or calming you down. So like if you were standing there and they did it to you, you might not be able to move your feet, but you wouldn't actually feel terrified. They didn't use the calcium setting very often. One of the weapons they could set to hypnotize a person. When they used that setting, they typically liked a clean shot at one of your temples. And what it would do is induce the same as if you were hypnotized. They could turn it on instantaneously and turn it off instantaneously. And it was common to have missing time experiences One day I was walking from my theodolite stand to the weather shack. It happened a large number of times, but on this day in particular. And it was like 19 or 20 steps from the theodolite stand to my weather shack. And I could clearly remember taking step 12. And I could clearly remember finishing step 14. But in between those two steps, almost 20 minutes went by. You know, it used to annoy me greatly until I'd finally gotten to where I could break through that hypnotism by relaxing and letting your mind wander. And what had happened was, it was one of the early days in '65. Range 4 Harry had brought some new arrivals around, and he had stepped out from the alleyway between my weather shack and the supply shed and had a clean shot at my right temple and hypnotized me as I was taking step 13. And then while I stood there, he brought out the new arrivals and said, "This is Charlie. See, he's got teeth. Open your mouth, Charlie," just like you do when you're hypnotized. And said he eats more times than we do, and, giving him the tour. This is what a human is. And then when they all went back in, then he's, really, took him about 20 minutes to go through his introducing them to a human routine, and then released it, and then went on. Because of a number of episodes like that, I used to have a policy of writing the time down when I did things. So I used to have a policy of writing down the time, and before I started walking back to my weather shack, of writing down on my weather report, when I left the theodolite stand, and then writing down on my weather report when I got to my weather shack. And of course, it should only be like a minute or two, you see. And just to see if they'd done that to me, and I didn't remember it because they could do it so quickly. I'll say one more thing about the weapons. They had another setting that I know about, the iodine setting. And if they hit you with the iodine setting, especially in the thyroid area, it would affect the iodine in your blood, and it would alter the chemistry of the blood so that your blood would seep through the arteries, and you'd bleed to death in like 2 minutes. Now, nothing I did was ever classified. Nobody ever gave me a briefing before I went out there. Nobody ever gave me a briefing when I came back. My orders said that nothing I did was ever classified. I was never part of a project. We were never building like airplanes or missiles. So therefore, I was never shown any classified drawings or anything like that. Everything I know I had to figure out for myself. There's a good reason for that. The aliens don't handle anger the way humans do. When they become angry, they either go away or they kill you, or, humans, we get angry with each other and we fight and then we become good friends. The aliens, at least where humans are concerned, or at least my experiences, aren't like that. They're either pleasant or you're in trouble. If I didn't bring anything off the ranges, I didn't bring any photographs, any documents, any material. I came off only with my memories. There was nothing to debrief me on. The alien mothers, remember, are very proud of their ability to raise their children. If anything I did was classified, that would mean, for example, that after the teacher brought her daughter and her her daughter's playmates around to simply play, then I would have had to have been called in and be debriefed by CIA guards. That would have upset the teacher beyond limit, to have two ordinary human guards call me in and start asking questions. How does the teacher take care of her children? Do you think she's doing a good job? Do you think? I mean, you wouldn't have had to tell her. The next time I went out there using their communication equipment, she would have just said, she would have just figured it right out. Or the next time the generals showed up, she'd have just figured it right out. Well, remember the experience of that CIA guard on the steps of that he related to me on the steps of the Capitol building. The idea of upsetting the teacher, I mean, she was perfectly willing to just jerk the weapon and say, who's given the orders? I thought we had an agreement, The committee had agreed, which included the teacher, Range 4 Harry, some of the other tall whites, as well as the American generals, They had agreed that nothing I did would ever be classified, and the tall whites expect their agreements to be carried out, just like Philadelphia lawyers, to the letter. They go through a lot of trouble. They are very conscious of their agreements, and they keep them to the letter, and they expect the same from humans. 40 years isn't much time for the tall whites, since they live so much longer than we do. If anything I did was classified, they agreed that nothing I did would ever be classified. They meant that, period, and they meant the American generals to keep that, period. And after all, I don't have any drawings or pictures. I didn't, the log books that were out there, I left out there. And so there were, usually classification refers to material things, drawings, material, whatever. When I was out there, I never, I never observed the aliens to do anything magical. They were very good at building craft that traveled faster than the speed of light. They did not travel in time. I never observed them traveling to another dimension. I never saw, I mean, they're not angels, they're just creatures like us. But I'm very religious, I'm Roman Catholic, that angels are angels and aliens are aliens. They did not, they did not come to teach me anything. They came for their purposes. They didn't, currently it seems to me that American physics is kind of in the reverse Galileo position. In the time of Galileo, religious leaders required that scientists think inside the box, and scientists like Galileo wanted to experiment and think outside the box. Now, however, the situation appears to be reversed. American physicists seem to think that Einstein was always and forever perfect and complete, and so American scientists keep thinking inside the box. In Hall photon theory, my belief is that inside the photon, there is a third field, but currently the box says there's only two fields. Most scientists won't consider it. They're insisting on thinking inside the box for religious reasons, pretending it's science, you see. As I describe in the appendix of book 3, I show in a scientific manner how scientists should be approaching that. Currently, it's the religious leaders who are willing to consider guys like Monsignor Balducci, I believe, and so on, who are willing to think outside the box and say, of course, there can be intelligent life on other planets. One of the biggest shocks that I had to overcome in 1965 and 66 was once I realized that they were real, they were here, and that Einstein was wrong, and that God created life on many, similar to us, on a whole bunch of different planets. It was the shock of realizing that so many people had been so wrong for so long, you know? I mean, once you saw their craft come in, defeated, floating on the gravity field in perfect silence and landing, it was the shock of saying, how could so many American scientists not have discovered that, or not even be trying to discover it, not even be thinking about that? Yeah, and likewise, from a religious point of view, it seems the teacher herself, one time on a different night when I went over there and I was talking to her, and she was willing to answer a few questions. She was teasing me because they have a dry sense of humor, and they liked to outthink me, and they could do so very quickly or very easily. And she said, and I was saying, she was making a long story short. She was pointing up to the stars in the sky, and she said, "You can see all the stars in the sky. Surely you didn't think you were alone." And at the time, I had, and then they were all laughing, surely you didn't think that whatever life was on the earth wouldn't be repeated on the other stars, and I had, and then they were all laughing. Boy, is he silly, And it just seems so obvious to me when you go out at night and you look up at the stars of the sky, that whatever God did to make life here on earth, he must have done it again, because there are so many stars in the universe and it's so vast. And religious leaders are willing to think outside the box. Whereas now, when I go and I talk to the scientists and stuff, they all start with this box called Einstein. Einstein himself never claimed to be perfect and complete, but all of his followers seemed to claim that he was perfect and complete. And I think that's one of my observations is that box they're in. Well, remember when the teacher said that on other planets the intelligent beings typically killed off the animals, she was referring to other planets she had seen with intelligent life on them, but she didn't elaborate. And the reason is because when they came for their purposes. They didn't come to say, let me tell Charlie everything there is to know about the universe. They didn't care. If they didn't have anything to say, some nights they might just come, not say anything. The kids might play and they might leave, especially the men. If there was no reason for them to actually come and talk when they were close, like that night when there were the 3 electrical engineers there. They wanted to see me start up the electrical generator because that's the same kind of power source the U.S. Air Force had given them for use up on their hangar because it was built by the Air Force. And they wanted to see how I used it as part of their training program, see? Well, from their point of view, there's no reason to talk to me about it. They just want to see me do it. So they came and just stood there and watched. And then, eventually Charlie's bright enough to figure out that I should just carry on with my duties and they would just stand and watch. And then, if there had been a reason for them to say, what does this do? Then they would have said, what does that do? But they didn't come and say, oh, let me tell you about this star, or let me tell you about that star, or anything like that. One of the things I had to do is put aside the baggage of Hollywood. We all know how Hollywood thinks things are supposed to go. According to Hollywood, when aliens come, there's supposed to be lights in the sky, and they're supposed to be pretty colored and move fast and have clever formations. And then they're supposed to land over there, and somebody's supposed to come out and do weird things. I really wasn't ready in the 60s for the idea that I would just walk around the corner of one of my weather shack, and there would be a man standing there the day I did at Range 1, and he wasn't human, and he was just standing there looking at me, and what he was doing is guarding the play area where the teacher and the children were playing. And you hadn't seen the craft, you hadn't seen the scout craft, you hadn't seen him come, you hadn't seen him leave. There was no reason for him to say anything because there's no reason for you to know what he's doing there. He's just guarding the entrance to where the kids and the teacher are playing on that day. And if you feel like standing there and looking at him, well, that's fine with him. If you feel like running away, that's fine with him, because he's not human. He sees it differently, and it took me he's not human. He sees it differently, and it took me a while. It took me a very long time, several weeks, to get used to the idea that they are the way they are that way because they like themselves being that way, and that's different than the way Hollywood would have us think they were. And of course, one of the biggest shocks is they were so similar to us in so many ways. They love their children. They have a dry sense of humor. They love to tell jokes and laugh, and they get bored out of their gourd up in the base. One of the common things to talk about with the young, tall white women was fashions. The Air Force provided them with clothes straight out of the Sears catalog. One of the jokes the teacher used to make about the Air Force generals is up on their base in their commissary, there were some clothes that the generals had picked that they could choose from. And of course, the teacher used to say, well, all the American generals are all old men, so naturally they have no fashion sense, right? And she used to laugh about the fashions that the generals thought they should wear, you see. And one of the things that she and the other young, tall white women wanted to do was to go into town and buy pretty clothes. And of course, we don't think of aliens that way, but when in my weather shack, I used to have a Sears catalog, a Montgomery Ward's catalog, a J.P. Penney's catalog. We had outdoor plumbing, and so I had several copies of the catalogs for several reasons. And one of the things that the young, tall white women used to like to do is to come through and look through my catalogs. And what they'd be looking at are women's clothes. Sometimes when you'd see them out in the desert, or especially on the morning, what they'd be wearing were clearly clothes straight out of the Sears catalog or the Montgomery Ward's catalog. And they were very, they were as proud of the new clothes as any Earth woman would be. And the teacher was very proud of her ability to dress up and look like a nurse. And it took me a long time to get over the baggage from Hollywood, because every time you look at a Hollywood movie, aliens are supposed to be weird and different, Yeah, and I really, it took me. It was such a shock to have like the teacher walk in with, wearing a new dress that she had bought from Sears and proudly show it off and say, "What do you think of my dress?" Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic documentary, to say the least. And I didn't want to interrupt to those of you that were, coming in, during the live while it was going. But shout out to everyone who came through. I see all of you, Queen's Throne, Gloria, TRG. We got who else we got up in the house here? I got to scroll all the way up to Emmanuel. Hello. Hey, fan. Good to see you. Hey, Sugar T. How are you? And then Majestic Pharaoh. Hello there. Nice to meet you. Salute to you. So, yeah, I wanted to play that because it's good content and it's very informational. And, a lot of times it's nice to kind of just zone out sometimes, a lot of the stuff that you all may think is not real exists. So keep that in mind, guys. But before I get up out of here, okay, before I get up out of here, allow me to pay some bills, please. Shout out to the Leak You community. Please join us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Amazon Music.
Please hit the like. Thank you.
The judgment sentence that you are an asshole. The trial is over. Thank you, everybody.
Let's play a game. You have 10 seconds to take all your stuff and get out of my life. 10, 9, 8.
God bless you, motherfucker.
You're really smart. Like really, really, really smart like I am.
All right, guys, have a fantastic rest of your week. Until next time.